Hey guys, welcome to my channel Harshiva Education, and today we will be talking about Flutter Network Layer with provider, and I'll show you one application which access information from network layer with proper architecture. So we'll be using provider for state management. So this would be the application which we'll build. So this like a network layer with provider. So very simple application. What we are doing is we are just hitting a API, and based on that API we just print some information from that API. So basically in our Flutter dev we have a tutorial for HTTP package, how to fetch data from internet, right? So in this tutorial also we'll be talking about will fetch data using HTTP package, but for state management we'll be using provider. So as in this tutorial we'll use this API, this JSON placeholder API. So if you go and see over here, so it just gives you user ID and title. This is an API, and if you see in our response we just print the title which we get from this API. So we'll be creating a proper and clean architecture. So this is this so we'll I'll tell you everything. So before we proceed, let me tell you why we want to go ahead with provider, right? So there are multiple ways to manage state in Flutter. So the basic one is stateful widget, which comes with Flutter. Like it's the inbuilt one, but there is a problem with that. The problem is if you so Flutter is what, it's a tree of widget, right? So it's like one widget, then you create another widget inside, and like inherit, like it's a tree of widget. So on top of the root tree you have some widget, and then under that you have some other widget. So how we pass data between these widgets using this stateful because of these stateful widgets. So passing data from one widget to another widget, like from top widget to bottom widget, you have to pass it using parameters. Like in functions you have to pass it using parameters. So it was way too much difficult in stateful widget. It's much simpler, but it's very difficult to manage in large applications. If you have very simple application, then it's good enough. Like if you are just learning Flutter, then please do go ahead and learn stateful widget first, because that will help you. So for simple application stateful widget is fine, but if you're building a very huge application which has multiple pages, then stateful widget is not much recommended. Okay, now the next one we had is block. So block is, it's kind of pattern. So with this, what we were doing is we were using streams and stream controllers to manage data from our network APIs to our views. How we were bridging the data between network API to views, and how we were separating the data. So this was working good. It's good to use block pattern as well, but there was a lot of boilerplates because you'll be writing a lot of stream controllers to manage your data. So block is good, but it is not recommended anymore from Google. So Google is now recommending provider. So with provider you'll be able to separate UI logic with business logic very clearly. So it would be crystal clear, and your architecture will automatically become very good if you use provider. So what it does, it's like a dependency injection. So if you want to send data from top widget to like the bottommost widget, you will be injecting the dependency from this widget to this widget. So you won't be passing it through each of the widget on the way, like on the way to your from your top widget to bottom widget. You will be injecting the dependency from your top widget to the bottom widget. So it's like uh, from top widget where you have your data, you'll be creating a notifier, and the bottom widget where you need the data, you will create a listener, and then this listener will listen whenever there is any update in this notifier. So it's like a kind of observer pattern, but yeah. So it is good because it just it is not like you are creating a global instance of your data and then using it. You are injecting your data from top to bottom using provider. So let's see how we do it exactly in Flutter. So before getting more deep into provider, as I said, we will be creating a clean architecture. So I have already created this application. I won't be writing code over here. I'll give GitHub link in the description, so you can go and check out the code over there. So what we are doing over here is for clean architecture, you should have good folder structure. So if you are, so I'm an iOS developer, and even Android developers, if you're familiar with MVVM pattern, model view model pattern, then it'll be easier for you. So in the in the folder structure, I have views. So all the UI views which is present to our user on our app, then those will go in views folder. Then repositories, it's like our service layer, will be doing all the service call, and all the logics will be writing in the repository layer, in the repository folder. So it's like view model of your MVVM. So repository is nothing but your view model. And then providers are the state management technique which we will be using to provide data from our API layer to view, uh, to our views, right? So how the way we send data from our API layer to our views is using the providers. And then we have models. You have to create models for your APIs, and then network module, right? So network module is the main one, right? You have to it will be called for any of your API calls. So what I have done is I have this HTTP client dot. So this will over here you can write your HTTP get method, HTTP post method, and then put, delete, everything you can write over here, right? So what I have done, my first function is fetch data, and then it requests your URL and query parameters. And then based on this query parameter and URL, you will call HTTP get method. So uh, this is like advanced tutorial, so I won't be telling you what exactly how you get data from HTTP. For that you can go through this page, this tutorial from Flutter Dev, which is very simple. So all you have to do is call this HTTP package in your pubspec YML. So if you see in pubspec YML, I have called this HTTP package, and now I'm able to access HTTP in our code. So HTTP dot as HTTP, and with that I can call this get request, and it will give me response. So this response I am passing it to this return response function, and this will handle all the responses. So if I have status code of 200, then I'll just decode my response, json.decode, and then I'll get my response in proper format, and then I'll return this. And if I get like 400 and 401 and 403, these kind of errors, then I am you know throwing some custom exceptions. These are my custom exceptions. So I have created these exception in this API exception .dart file. So in this exception class, we'll have message and prefix. So if you see, the message is the error message itself, which we'll be getting from our exception. And then the prefix is something for you to easily understand that which exception has occurred. So like for this bad request exception, I'll be giving invalid request. For an unauthorized exception, I have given unauthorized. So something like this. For authentication exception, you can say authentication failed. So something like this you can also create. And then for all the API, what response we are getting, we'll create a generic response format. So this is my generic API response format. So we will have status, we'll have data, so response data, and then we'll have some message like uh, the error message will be storing in this. So status, there are three types of status: loading, completed, and error. So if it is completed, then we should have our data as well. So data is like generic types, any type of data we can pass it through here. And then if it is loading or error, we'll send custom messages. Yeah, so this is our generic API response. You can use exactly same thing in your app as well. And then for URLs, so in, if you have noticed in HTTP client, for URL, this URL is only path of my URL, and then I'm using API base URL as well. So if you go in uh, API base class, what it does, it returns the base URL. So if you are in release mode, then your prod URL will be here. Otherwise, in debug mode, your base URL. So whatever is your company's base URL, your client's base URL, you can paste it here. And then because base URL will be used like reused, that's why we are creating a different class itself for it. And then for prod, will return different base URL, and for staging or development, will be returning different base URL. But our API path, after base URL, will be appending API path, which will be different for different APIs. So in this example, I have only used one API, fetch album. So for fetch album, I have created a class API path helper, and then for fetch album, I'll return this path. So this get value will give me this path. So over here in my HTTP client, this URL is path, and then this base URL is the base URL, which is common for all the APIs. This URL will keep on changing uh, based on your APIs. And then if you have so if you see this, this is a this is an optional parameter. So if you have query parameters for your get request, then you will append it like this. So I have this dot query params functions, which will return me all the query params after this question mark, right? So if it is there, if it is params is not null, then we'll return this. Otherwise, there's no need of that, right? And then yeah, we return our response. So this is what you need to have in your network module: API base, API exception, API path, right? For different APIs, API generic API response, and then your HTTP clients, which will make your actual request, make your actual HTTP request. So I have created header also. If you can see over here, you can create one more one more optional parameter over here for header. And if you want to append more header, you can, in this header variable itself, you can append more headers and then pass it over here. So this is like generic network module, which you can use for all the APIs in your application, right? So this would not change. This will be similar for all your APIs. What you will be changing is for each API you will have a response. So based on those response, you'll create this response model. So this is my album model, which is my API. So my API is giving album details, so my model name is album, and it gives me user id and title. So based on that, I have created this model, response model. So this for every API you'll have different response models, so you'll have to create all those model in this folder. And then to call these API, to call these API, you will be calling all those service requests in this album underscore repo. So in this repositories folder, so in this repository folder you'll be creating repos, different repos for all these services. So for me, I have to call my this service right here. So for this fetch album, I have created this album repository, and then as you see, it's very simple. Await HTTP client. This is my the HTTP client which we have created over here in our network module. This is a singleton, so I have instance of that. So in so HTTP client dot instance dot fetch data, and then I have passed my URL. Oh, sorry. So I pass my URL. So over here in repository, yeah. So I pass my URL over here. So it will give me my response, and then from this album from JSON, this JSON is passing that response for my album model. So from JSON, I'll get my uh, data in my album. Where is it? I'm sorry, album repo. Yeah. So over here, I'll get this will return me my album response, right? So now I have created my network module. I have my album. I have called my album details using this fetch data, right? So I have called it and I have my response. Now how do I pass this response to my view? How do I send it? So this is where my album provider will come. Album details provider I have created. So as I said, for providers, how it works is you make it as notifier. So that is why we have change notifier. So again, for provider also, it is a package. So you will have to go in your pubspec YML and add provider in your pubspec YML. Then only you will be able to use it in your application. So for any provider class, it has to be with change notifier. Okay, and then what I have done for my provider class is I am making an instance of my album repository, and then API response. So as I said, all the response will be in this API response format. So anything, so in this case, my response will come as album model, album response model, right? So, and I'm wrapping it with API response. So this is my response. This is the response I'll be sending to my view, and this album is wrapped inside my API response, which is my generic response model, like this, right? So with that, I'll be able to access data for album. I'll be able to access the API status, and then I'll be able to access any message which we are getting for loading or error message. So yes, so that is why we are wrapping it inside API response, uh, inside our generic API response. And then this is just a getter for our API response album. And then in our constructor album details provider, I just initialize album repository and fetch album details list, I call this. And then in this, before making the API request, I say API response dot loading. So it means that we have made the request. We have made the request for album details, but I haven't received it yet. So this is like loading. right? And then we say notify listener. So this is the main thing, you have to write notify listener, then only your view class will be able to listen it. And then after after from this album repository, you can call this fetch album details, and this will give you data. So once you have the data, you will again do notify listener. And then if in case you have any error, then you update your album uh, you know album response and do notify listener again. So how do we collect, how do we listen to this change, this notifier? So I have created a provider which notifies whenever these data changes, right? Whenever we are fetching album details, once it is completed and if there is an error, it will create a notification. How do we listen to it? So to listen to it, in our home page, I have written a consumer, but this will not work unless you have wrapped it. So where you have called your home page, you have to wrap it under this change notifier provider. So this change notifier provider will give you a context of this album details provider. So this is very important, you have to wrap your widget in change notifier provider, then only you'll be able to listen to it. So over here I have used multi provider. You can avoid this step as well if you have only one provider, but in mostly in your applications you will be writing multiple providers, so you'll have to write. So if you have any other provider, you can write over here itself change notify provider, and then your notify provider name over here. But right now I have only one provider, so that's not needed. But in case if you have multiple providers, that's why it's good to write it inside multi-provider. Otherwise just one provider, this writing this itself is good enough. So once you have wrapped your home page, your widget on which you want to listen the notifier, all you have to do in your home page. So over here, this is my home page which is appearing over here. So if you see, my app bar title is network layer with provider, and then in container, in body, I have edge inset all 20. So and then child is album title, and I just gave the context of build context. In album title, I am consuming the album details provider. So this is like three parts. So first, for provider, you will be writing your notifier. So this is how we wrote our notifier, and then we created our notifications. And then in your widget where you want to listen it, you have to say the change notifier provider. This is the notifier provider. So here we created change notifier. Here we will be writing that this widget is our change notifier provider. This is the widget which will be listening to those notifications. And then over here you will be consuming those notifications. So this is where you'll be using those notifications. So in this child will be returning consumer album details provider, and then this will give you a builder with context, my model and child. So what we need is just my model. So with this my model, I'll be able to access this album of this album details provider, and with this album I'll be able to access whether it's data, like whether the data of our album model, and then if there is any error or what is the status of this album, this API. So over here if you can see, so my model album and then status. So if status is completed, then I can call my model album data. So album dot data, so data is the one which is keeping the actual data, and then title is the album title over here, this class, model class. So I'm able to access that this album model class directly from my view class over here we call it widget. And so directly from here I can access this title. So this is the beauty of provider. It is like injecting your data from network layer to views directly without any without passing it through parameters and everything. And then if the status is error, then we say whatever the message, the error message will come over here, album error message, and else we just print this message. So if I can just show you, so yeah, this is our application. So if I run it, notice it will say loading first because our message over here, not over here, so yeah, let's just see, just run it. Yeah, first it says loading and then it gives you the actual result. So yeah, exactly the same thing what we wanted. So yeah, over here if you see, when we are loading our data, we are passing this loading message. So that's why we are seeing loading first, and then we once the API request is complete, then we are getting our data, the album data, and based on that data, we are showing our title. So we just load it again. You can see it loading, and then we have our title. So yeah, that's all. So this is how you can create your application with Flutter using provider. And this I really like this architecture because it's very clean. So I'll be using it in my application. So if you like it, you can use it in your application as well. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and like and comment. Bye bye.